The first thing you notice about being trapped is how loud silence can become. I hadn't planned on spending more than a few hours at the cabin with Marcus. The weekend retreat was supposed to be a quick team-building exercise, 12 of us from the accounting firm scattered across 3 different cabins with activities planned from dawn to dusk. A manufactured kind of bonding that our boss thought would somehow translate into better quarterly reports. But then the storm hit. Not the gentle dusting of snow the weather service had predicted, but something fierce and unforgiving that turned the mountain roads into rivers of ice and brought down power lines like dominoes. By the time we realized how serious it was, the others had already evacuated to the main lodge 5 miles down the mountain. Marcus and I were stuck in cabin 7, the furthest from everything, with a dead phone line and no cell service. "Well," Marcus said, setting down his overnight bag with a resigned thud, "this is happening." I watched him survey the space. One room with a kitchenette, a stone fireplace, a worn leather couch, and a single bed that suddenly seemed both too small and too significant. We'd worked in adjacent cubicles for 2 years, exchanged pleasantries about weekend plans, and complained about coffee quality, but we'd never been alone together for more than the length of an elevator ride. The cabin felt impossibly intimate. Every sound, the zip of his jacket, the rustle of his movements, even his breathing seemed amplified in the small space. Outside, the wind began to howl with a voice that sounded almost human. "I can take the couch," I offered, though neither of us had addressed the sleeping arrangements yet. He glanced at the narrow piece of furniture, then at me, and something flickered across his face too quickly to interpret. "We'll figure it out," he said, and turned toward the window. The snow was falling in thick, determined sheets now, already erasing the outline of my car in the driveway. The world beyond the glass was disappearing, leaving us suspended in this small wooden box with only each other and the growing weight of silence. I busied myself with unpacking, though I'd only brought enough for an overnight stay. A change of clothes, toiletries, the novel I'd been meaning to finish for months. Marcus did the same, moving with the careful efficiency I'd observed in the office. Everything in its place, no wasted motion. But here, in this confined space, his precision felt different, intimate, like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to. "Are you hungry?" he asked after we'd both run out of tasks to perform. I wasn't particularly, but eating would give us something to do besides sit in the thickening quiet. "Sure." The kitchenette was barely large enough for one person, let alone two, but Marcus seemed determined to cook. He'd found pasta in the cupboard and a jar of marinara sauce that looked like it had been there since the cabin was built. I offered to help, but he waved me off. "I've got it," he said, and there was something in his voice, not dismissive, but careful, like he needed the task, needed to keep his hands busy. So I sat at the small wooden table and watched him work. It was such an ordinary thing, cooking pasta, but in the firelight that danced across the cabin walls, it felt charged with meaning I couldn't name. The way he moved around the tiny space, the concentration in his face as he stirred the sauce, the unconscious grace in his movements, it was like seeing him for the first time. Marcus had always been good-looking in that understated way that doesn't announce itself. Dark hair that curled slightly at the edges, eyes the color of coffee, a mouth that curved easily into smiles during office small talk. But I'd trained myself not to notice, not to linger on the line of his shoulders or the way his laugh sounded when he was genuinely amused rather than just being polite. Now, with nowhere to look but at him, I was noticing everything. The storm outside intensified, rattling the windows with renewed fury. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, leaving us in the amber glow of the fireplace. "Shit," Marcus muttered, though he kept stirring the pasta by the light from the flames. "There are some candles on the mantel," I said, grateful for the excuse to move, to break the spell of watching him. I lit 3 pillar candles with matches from beside the fireplace, and the cabin transformed. The harsh edges of furniture softened into shadows, and everything took on a warm, golden quality that made the space feel even smaller, even more intimate. "Better?" I asked. Marcus turned from the stove, and for a moment his eyes met mine across the flickering light. Something passed between us, A recognition, maybe, or a question neither of us was ready to ask. The silence stretched long enough that I felt my pulse quicken. "Yeah," he said finally. "Better." We ate in relative quiet, the only sounds the storm outside and the occasional crackle of the fire. The pasta was simple but good, and I found myself focusing on the meal with unusual intensity, hyper-aware of Marcus across from me, of the way the candlelight played across his features, making them softer somehow, more vulnerable. "This is surreal," I said eventually, because the silence was becoming dangerous in ways I didn't want to examine. "What is?" I gestured around the cabin. "This, being stuck here. I keep thinking someone's going to call and tell us the roads are clear." "The phone's dead," he reminded me. "And even if it wasn't," he glanced toward the window where the snow continued its relentless assault, "we're not going anywhere tonight." The finality of it settled over us. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Only him, only me. And the silence that seemed to know too much. After dinner, we cleaned up together in the small space, bumping shoulders at the sink, our hands occasionally brushing as we passed dishes back and forth. Each contact felt electric, charged with something neither of us was acknowledging. I found myself holding my breath when he reached past me for a towel, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with something warmer, more him. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" he said as we finished. His voice was quieter now, more thoughtful. "Just being here." I dried the last plate with more care than it required, using the task to avoid looking at him directly. "Yeah, strange, but not bad." When I finally glanced up, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. The candlelight caught the gold flecks in his dark eyes, and for a heartbeat, the air between us felt charged with possibility. Then he looked away, clearing his throat. "I should put another log on the fire." The evening stretched ahead of us, hours of enforced proximity with nothing but the storm for company. We settled onto the couch with the pretense of watching the flames, but I was acutely aware of every inch of space between us, of the way Marcus sat with his hands clasped loosely in his lap, of how his breathing had changed since dinner. The fire crackled and hissed, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the wind howled with increasing intensity, rattling the windows and making the cabin feel even more isolated from the world. It was almost midnight, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. "I can't remember the last time I was somewhere this quiet," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. I knew what he meant. In the city, there was always noise: traffic, sirens, the hum of air conditioning, the buzz of fluorescent lights. Here, with the power out and nothing but wilderness for miles, the silence was almost oppressive in its completeness. "It's like the world stopped," I said. "Maybe it did." He shifted slightly on the couch, and I felt the movement through the cushions. "Maybe this is all there is now. Just this." There was something in his voice that made me look at him, really look at him. His profile was outlined by the firelight, and I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers worried at the seam of his jeans. He looked vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before, stripped of the professional armor we all wore at the office. "Are you okay?" I asked. He was quiet for so long I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he turned, and his eyes found mine in the flickering light. "I don't know," he said honestly. I don't know what this feels like." The admission hung between us, raw and unguarded. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance between us on the couch, but I didn't know what that would mean or where it would lead. Instead, I sat frozen, caught between wanting and not knowing what I wanted. The cold was beginning to seep through the cabin walls despite the fire. Masinat sisi. I pulled a throw blanket from the back of the couch and wrapped it around my shoulders, but Marcus was still in just his sweater, and I could see him beginning to shiver slightly. "Here," I said, extending one edge of the blanket toward him. "We might as well share." For a moment he hesitated, and I wondered if I'd crossed some invisible line. But then he scooted closer, and I wrapped the blanket around both our shoulders, cocooning us in warmth and proximity that made my heart race. His shoulder pressed against mine, solid and warm, and I could feel the rise and fall of his breathing, The scent of his cologne was stronger now, mixed with something earthier, wood smoke and winter air, and something uniquely him that made me want to turn my face into his neck and breathe him in. Better? I asked, echoing his earlier question. Yeah, his voice was rough, barely audible. Better. We sat like that as the fire burned lower, neither of us moving to disturb the careful balance we'd created. I was hyper-aware of every point of contact, his shoulder against mine, his thigh warm along the length of my leg, the way his breathing had synchronized with mine without either of us meaning it to. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside our shared cocoon of warmth, the world had narrowed to just this, the two of us, the dying fire, and the dangerous intimacy of forced proximity. I must have dozed because I woke to find my head tilted against Marcus's shoulder, the blanket twisted around us both. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the cabin in deep shadows, and Marcus's breathing was slow and even beneath my cheek. For a moment, I didn't move. I knew I should. This was crossing lines we hadn't discussed, venturing into territory that could change everything between us. But he was warm and solid and real beneath my face, and the storm outside made the world feel like it had contracted to just this cabin, this couch, this moment. Then he stirred, and I felt him tense as he realized where we were, how we'd ended up pressed together in sleep. Sorry, I mumbled, starting to pull away. His hand found my wrist, stopping me. Don't. The word was barely audible, more breath than voice. Don't move, not yet. So I stayed, my heart hammering against my ribs, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath my cheek and wondering what we were doing, what we were becoming in this snow-locked cabin with nowhere to run from whatever was building between us. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things neither of us was ready to say, heavy with the weight of recognition and want and the terrifying vulnerability of being seen. Eventually, though, the dying fire forced us to acknowledge the practical realities of the night. The cabin was growing cold, and we both needed actual sleep, not the fitful dozing we'd managed on the couch. I should let you get some proper rest, Marcus said, reluctantly pulling away from our shared warmth. I wanted to protest, to find some excuse to stay close, but I couldn't find the words that wouldn't reveal too much. Instead, I nodded and stood, the blanket falling away and leaving me immediately cold. You sure you don't want the bed? I offered one more time. I'm sure. But his eyes lingered on my face in the dim light, and I wondered what he was thinking, what he was holding back. I found my toiletries and changed into sleep clothes in the small bathroom, trying not to think about Marcus preparing for bed just on the other side of the thin door. When I emerged, he was arranging pillows on the couch, having changed into flannel pajama pants and a t-shirt that clung to the lines of his chest in ways that made my mouth go dry. Good night, then, I said, hovering uncertainly by the bedroom doorway. Good night. But neither of us moved, and the air between us felt charged with everything we were now saying. I wanted to cross to him to offer some gesture of comfort or connection, but I didn't know what that would mean, didn't know if I was reading the signals right or projecting my own confusion onto his careful politeness. Finally, I forced myself to turn away, to close the bedroom door and slip between the cold sheets of the narrow bed. I could hear him moving around in the main room, the creak of the couch as he settled, the rustle of blankets being arranged. Then silence. I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the storm rage outside and trying not to think about Marcus just 20 feet away, trying not to imagine what would happen if I got up, opened the door, crossed to the couch where he lay sleepless in the dark. Because I knew he was awake. I could feel it somehow, the awareness that hummed between us even through the closed door, the recognition of something that had shifted during our long evening of enforced proximity, something that couldn't be taken back or ignored now that it had been acknowledged. I must have finally drifted off because I woke to the sound of my name being whispered into the darkness. James? His voice was so quiet I might have imagined it, but something in the way he said my name, tentative, questioning, full of vulnerability, made my heart stop. I held my breath, waiting, not sure if I should respond or pretend to be asleep. The cabin was completely dark now, the fire reduced to cold ashes, and I couldn't see anything beyond the faint outline of the window. Then, so softly I almost missed it, came the words that changed everything. I don't think I can keep pretending I don't feel it. The admission hung in the darkness between us, raw and honest and terrifying in its implications. I lay frozen, my heart racing, knowing that everything had just shifted irreversibly and wondering what came next, what happened when morning came and we had to face each other in the light. But for now, there was only the darkness and his whispered confession, and the storm that showed no signs of letting up, keeping us trapped in this small space with nowhere to hide from whatever was growing between us. I closed my eyes and let the silence swallow us both, knowing that sleep wouldn't come again tonight, knowing that morning would bring conversations we weren't prepared for and decisions that would change the careful distance we'd maintained for 2 years. Outside, the storm raged on, and inside something equally powerful had been unleashed, something that demanded acknowledgement, demanded courage, demanded an honesty neither of us had been prepared to offer. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight there was only the darkness and his whispered truth and the dangerous intimacy of two people who could no longer pretend they didn't see what was happening between them. The snow continued to fall, sealing us in together, and I wondered if either of us would be the same when it finally stopped. Part 2. The silence after his whispered confession stretched like a held breath. I lay in the narrow bed, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain he could hear it through the thin walls of the cabin. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, but inside, everything had gone quiet except for the soft crackle of dying embers in the fireplace. I don't think I can keep pretending I don't feel it. The words echoed in the darkness, more real now than when he'd first spoken them. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing through every interaction we'd shared over the past 2 years, the lingering looks I'd convinced myself I'd imagined, the way he'd sometimes pause mid-sentence when our eyes met across the office, the careful distance he maintained that I'd interpreted as professional courtesy, but now wondered if it was something else entirely. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had become elastic in this snow-locked cabin, measured not by clocks but by the rhythm of our breathing and the gradual fading of the fire's glow. I heard him shift on the couch, the leather creaking softly under his weight. Then a longer silence, broken only by the wind howling through the trees outside. When I couldn't stand the quiet anymore, when the weight of his confession had settled so heavily in my chest that I could barely breathe, I pushed back the covers and stood. The cabin was almost completely dark now, the fire reduced to a few glowing coals that cast faint orange shadows on the walls. I could barely make out Marcus's silhouette on the couch, could hear the careful rhythm of his breathing that told me he was awake, waiting. My bare feet were silent on the wooden floor as I crossed the small space. I stopped beside the couch, close enough to see the outline of his face in the dim light, close enough to hear the slight catch in his breathing when he realized I was there. "James?" His voice was barely a whisper, uncertain and vulnerable in a way that made my chest ache. "I heard you," I said, my own voice rough with sleep and something deeper. "What you said." He sat up slowly, the blanket falling away from his shoulders. In the faint glow from the dying fire, I could see the tension in his posture, the careful way he held himself as if preparing for rejection. "I'm sorry," he began. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't." I sat down on the edge of the couch, close enough that our knees almost touched. "Don't apologize." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching my face in the dim light. "I didn't want you to know," he said finally, his voice so soft I had to lean closer to hear it. "But being here, with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, I can't help it." The admission hung between us, raw and honest. I found myself studying the familiar lines of his face as if seeing them for the first time, the curve of his mouth, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the vulnerability in his eyes that he usually kept so carefully hidden. "How long?" I asked. "How long have I felt this way?" He let out a shaky breath. "Since the Christmas party last year. You were laughing at something David said and you looked over at me, and for just a second," he shook his head. "I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just the wine and the holiday lights and wishful thinking. I remembered that night, the way the conversation had died when our eyes met across the crowded restaurant, the electric moment of recognition before someone had interrupted and the spell had been broken. I'd gone home that night and lain awake for hours, convincing myself I'd misread the situation. "You weren't imagining it," I said quietly. His eyes widened slightly. "James?" I felt it too. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. "That night, and other times, I just, I didn't know if you—" I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to voice the fear that had kept me silent for so long. We sat in the flickering darkness, the confession settling between us like something fragile and precious. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows, reminding us of the storm that had trapped us here, forced this moment into existence. Slowly, carefully, Marcus reached out his hand. His fingers brushed against mine where they rested on the couch between us, a tentative touch that sent electricity shooting up my arm. Instead of pulling away, I turned my palm up, letting our fingers intertwine. His hand was warm and slightly rough from weekend projects, familiar yet completely new in this context. We sat like that for long minutes, just breathing, just existing in this space we'd created between confession and consequence. "This is crazy," he whispered, but his fingers tightened around mine. "Yeah," I agreed, "completely crazy." But neither of us let go. The fire gave one final pop and settled into ash, leaving us in near complete darkness. I could hear Marcus's breathing, slightly uneven, could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the small space between us. "James," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke my name that made me look up, though I could barely see his face in the darkness. He was closer now, close enough that I could feel his breath warm against my cheek. My heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy, caught between wanting to close the distance between us and terrified of what that would mean. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. Instead of answering with words, I leaned forward the final few inches until our lips met. The kiss was soft, tentative, over almost before it began. But in that brief contact, something fundamental shifted between us. When we pulled apart, I could hear his sharp intake of breath, could feel the way his hand trembled where it held mine. "Oh," he breathed, and the single word held a universe of surprise and recognition and want. We sat frozen for a heartbeat, both of us afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. Then, slowly, carefully, I reached up and cupped his face in my free hand, my thumb tracing the line of his cheekbone. This time, when our lips met, neither of us pulled away. The kiss was still gentle, still careful, but deeper now, more sure of itself. I could taste the lingering hint of pasta sauce on his lips, could feel the slight stubble along his jaw where my thumb brushed against his skin. Every sense was heightened in the darkness, the warmth of his mouth, the sound of our breathing, the way he made a soft, involuntary sound when I deepened the kiss just slightly. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. Marcus rested his forehead against mine, and I could feel the rapid flutter of his pulse where my hand curved around his neck. "We should," he started, but the sentence died unfinished. "Should what?" I asked, though I knew what he meant. We should stop. We should think about this. We should consider the complications of Monday morning and office politics, and the careful professional distance we'd maintained for 2 years. Instead, I shifted closer on the couch until our bodies were pressed together from shoulder to knee. He made room for me willingly, his arm coming around my back to hold me against him. "This changes everything," he said into the darkness. "I know. We work together. We'll have to see each other every day." "I know," I repeated. But I didn't pull away. He was quiet for a long time, and I wondered if he was having second thoughts, if the reality of our situation was sinking in and making him regret the words that had started this. But then his arm tightened around me, pulling me closer against his side. "I don't care," he said finally. "I know I should, but I don't. Not tonight." We settled back against the couch cushions. my head finding the hollow between his shoulder and neck that seemed designed for exactly this purpose. His hand moved in slow circles on my back, and I let myself sink into the warmth and solid comfort of his body. Maybe the silence wasn't empty after all. Maybe it was full of every word we were too scared to say, every glance we'd convinced ourselves didn't mean anything, every moment of careful distance that had been hiding this. "What are you thinking?" Marcus asked softly, his voice vibrating through his chest where my ear was pressed against it. "That this feels right," I admitted. "Scary, but right." "Yeah." His lips pressed briefly against the top of my head. "It does." We lay like that as the storm continued outside, no longer fighting the pull between us, no longer pretending we didn't feel the electricity that sparked every time our bodies touched. But even as I relaxed into his embrace, part of me remained hyper-aware of how fragile this moment was, how easily it could shatter when morning came. As if reading my thoughts, Marcus shifted slightly, his hand stilling on my back. "What happens when the storm ends?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. When the storm ended, the roads would be cleared. We'd drive back to the city, back to our cubicles and our carefully maintained professional distance, back to a world where this kind of vulnerability wasn't safe, where the complications of workplace relationships and office gossip would intrude on whatever this was becoming. "Then we go back," I said, the words tasting bitter. "Pretend, forget. But tonight," I lifted my head to look at him, though I could barely make out his features in the darkness. "We don't have to." His hand found my face in the dark, fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a gentleness that made my breath catch. "No," he agreed. "Tonight we don't have to." He kissed me again, slower this time, deeper, as if he was trying to memorize the taste and feel of it. I lost myself in the warmth of his mouth, the way his hands moved through my hair, the soft sounds he made when I kissed the sensitive spot just below his ear. But we didn't push further than kissing, both of us seeming to understand instinctively that this moment was too precious, too fragile to rush. Instead, we explored this new territory between us with careful hands and whispered words, learning the geography of each other's bodies in the safest possible way. When exhaustion finally began to pull at us, we settled back into the couch, my body curved against his in a way that felt both completely natural and utterly revolutionary. His arm was solid around me, his breathing gradually evening out as sleep began to claim him. "James," he murmured, already half asleep. "Hmm? Thank you for this, for not running." I pressed a soft kiss to the underside of his jaw. "Thank you for not letting me." A sudden crash from outside made us both jolt awake. A large branch had fallen against the cabin's side wall, heavy with snow and broken by the wind. The sound was sharp and sudden in the quiet night, and for a moment we both froze, reality intruding on our carefully constructed bubble of intimacy. "Jesus," Marcus breathed, his arm tightening protectively around me. That sounded close. We listened for a moment, waiting to see if there would be more damage, but the only sound was the continued howling of the wind through the trees. The interruption had broken the spell, though, reminding us both of how isolated we were, how much larger forces were at work around us. "The storm's getting worse," I said unnecessarily. "Good," Marcus replied, and when I looked up at him in surprise, I could just make out the ghost of a smile on his face. "Means we're stuck here longer." But even as he said it, I could hear the uncertainty beneath the words. We both knew that morning would come eventually, that the storm would pass and the real world would intrude on whatever this was between us. The fallen branch was just a reminder of how temporary this sanctuary really was. As if responding to my thoughts, the wind outside began to quiet slightly, the relentless howling fading to a more moderate whistle. Marcus felt it too. I could sense the change in his posture, the way his breathing became more alert. "Don't think about it," I said softly, pressing closer to him. "Not yet." "I'm trying not to." His voice was rough with exhaustion and something deeper, but I keep wondering if this is real or if it's just circumstances. The storm, being trapped here, the isolation making us feel things we wouldn't normally feel. The doubt in his voice made my chest tighten. Is that what you think this is? He was quiet for a long time, his hand moving restlessly through my hair. I don't know, he said finally. I want it to be real. But I've been telling myself I was imagining this connection for so long that now that it's happening, I can't quite believe it. I understood what he meant. The safe fantasy of workplace crushes and unspoken attraction was one thing. The reality of lying in someone's arms, of having crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, was something else entirely. It's real, I said, lifting my head to look at him. What I felt before, what I feel now, it's real, Marcus. The storm didn't create this, it just gave us permission to stop hiding from it. He cupped my face in his hands, thumbs brushing across my cheekbones. Promise me something, he said. If when we get back to the real world, this doesn't make sense anymore, promise me we'll still be friends. That we won't make things weird at work. The request hit me like a punch to the chest, but I understood the fear behind it. We were both taking an enormous risk here, gambling not just our professional relationship but our friendship on something that might not survive outside this cabin. I promise, I said, even though the words felt like swallowing glass. But I don't think that's going to be a problem. You sound sure. I am sure. About this, about you. I kissed him softly, trying to pour all of my certainty into the contact. The storm didn't make me feel this way, Marcus. It just made it impossible to keep pretending I didn't. He relaxed slightly under my touch, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. We settled back into each other's arms, but sleep was elusive now. Both of us were too aware of the approaching dawn, too conscious of the way the storm seemed to be gradually weakening. Every few minutes, one of us would shift or sigh, betraying our shared anxiety about what morning would bring. Can I ask you something? I said into the darkness. Anything. That first day I started at the firm, do you remember? I felt him smile against my hair. You wore a blue tie, navy blue with small silver dots. You were nervous and trying not to show it, and you asked me 3 different people where the bathroom was before someone finally pointed you in the right direction. The specificity of his memory surprised me. You remember what tie I was wearing? I remember everything about that day. His voice was soft, almost embarrassed. You had this energy about you, this enthusiasm that was infectious, and when you smiled, he trailed off, shaking his head. I knew I was in trouble from the start. 2 years, I said wonderingly. We've been dancing around this for 2 years. Longer for me. I was interested before you even started officially. I saw your resume, your photo from the company directory. He laughed softly. I volunteered to be part of your orientation team just so I'd have an excuse to talk to you. The confession made warmth bloom in my chest. All those careful professional interactions, all those moments I'd convinced myself I was reading too much into, he'd been feeling it too, fighting the same internal battle between want and propriety. I had such a crush on you, I admitted. I used to time my coffee breaks to coincide with yours, just so I'd have an excuse to chat by the machine. I know, I did the same thing. We laughed quietly, the sound muffled by the storm but bright with shared recognition. 2 years of careful choreography, of managing our feelings and maintaining appropriate distance, and all it had taken was one snowstorm to bring it all into the open. The hours passed slowly. We dozed fitfully, waking periodically to adjust our position or simply to confirm that this was real, that we were actually here in each other's arms. Each time I surfaced from sleep, there was a moment of disorientation before the reality of the situation settled over me. We were here, we had crossed this line, and there was no taking it back. Around 4 in the morning, the storm finally began to weaken noticeably. The constant howling of the wind faded to intermittent gusts, and the snow's assault on the windows became less aggressive. We both felt the change, the way the cabin seemed to settle and quiet as the worst of the weather passed. It's stopping, Marcus said unnecessarily, his voice tight with something that might have been regret. Not yet. I pressed closer to him as if I could physically hold back the dawn through sheer will. We still have time, But we both knew the truth. Morning was coming, and with it all the complications we'd been holding at bay. The storm that had trapped us here and forced this honesty between us was finally beginning to pass. We lay in the growing quiet, neither of us speaking, both of us listening to the gradual calming of the world outside. The fire had long since died completely, leaving the cabin cold and gray, but the warmth between our bodies seemed to intensify as everything else grew still. "I don't want this to end," Marcus whispered against my hair. "It doesn't have to, not all of it. Doesn't it?" There was a hopelessness in his voice that broke my heart. "Monday morning, we'll be back in our cubicles. You'll be James from accounting again, and I'll be Marcus from IT support. We'll nod politely in the hallway and make small talk by the coffee machine, and all of this will feel like something that happened to someone else. Is that what you want?" No. The word was fierce, immediate. But wanting something and being able to have it aren't the same thing. I lifted my head to look at him, though the darkness made it nearly impossible to see his expression. "Why does it have to be one or the other? Why can't we figure out how to make this work in the real world?" "Because it's complicated, because there are policies and office politics and 100 different ways this could go wrong, and 100 different ways it could go right." He was quiet for a long time, his hand moving restlessly through my hair. "You make it sound simple." "Maybe it is. Maybe we're the ones making it complicated." Before he could respond, the first faint hint of gray light began to seep through the cabin windows. Dawn was still hours away, but the complete darkness of the storm night was beginning to lift, replaced by the softer darkness of early morning. We both saw it at the same time, the subtle change in the light that meant our time was running short. Outside, the wind had died to almost nothing, and the snow was falling more gently now, no longer the driving blizzard that had trapped us here. "The storm's ending," I said, stating the obvious because someone had to acknowledge it. "Yeah," Marcus's arm tightened around me. "It is." We lay there as the light gradually strengthened, watching the snow outside become visible as individual flakes rather than a solid wall of white. The world was taking shape again around us, emerging from the cocoon of isolation that had made this night possible. "What do we do now?" I asked. "I don't know." His voice was rough with exhaustion and uncertainty. "I've never done anything like this before." Neither have I. The admission hung between us, a reminder of how new and fragile this connection really was. We were both venturing into uncharted territory, with no map to guide us through the complexities of workplace relationships and professional boundaries. As the light continued to strengthen, I could begin to make out more details of the cabin around us, the cold fireplace, our scattered belongings, the evidence of the evening we'd spent discovering each other. It looked different in the growing daylight, less magical and more mundane. Reality was reasserting itself inch by inch. "I should probably move back to the bed," I said reluctantly, "in case someone comes to check on us." Marcus's arm tightened reflexively around me. "Not yet, a few more minutes." But we both knew that delaying the inevitable wouldn't change anything. Eventually, people would come looking for us, the roads would be cleared, we'd have to face the outside world and figure out how to integrate what had happened here with everything else in our lives. Still, I stayed curled against his side as the cabin grew brighter around us, memorizing the way his body felt against mine, the sound of his breathing, the smell of his skin mixed with wood smoke and winter air. These details would have to sustain me through whatever came next. By the time full daylight streamed through the windows, the snow had stopped entirely. The world outside was transformed, buried under feet of pristine white, but beautiful rather than threatening now that the storm had passed. Trees bent under the weight of snow created a winter wonderland that looked like something from a postcard. "It's beautiful," I said, though I made no move to get up from the couch. "Yeah." But Marcus wasn't looking out the window. He was looking at me, his expression soft and vulnerable in the morning light. "It is." The moment stretched between us, both of us aware that this might be the last time we could look at each other this way, without the weight of professional considerations and practical complications. Finally, reluctantly, I forced myself to sit up, breaking the warm cocoon of our embrace. The morning air was cold against my skin, making me immediately miss the warmth of his body. I should get dressed, I said. Make some coffee, pretend to be a respectable person who didn't spend the night falling for his coworker. Marcus caught my hand as I started to stand, his fingers intertwining with mine. James. I looked back at him, taking in the way his hair was mussed from sleep, the way the morning light caught the gold flecks in his eyes, the vulnerable openness in his expression that I'd never seen before this night. What? I asked softly. He was quiet for a long moment, seeming to struggle with whatever he wanted to say. Then finally, promise me one thing. Don't let this be just the storm talking. The request hit me with surprising force. After everything we'd shared, all the confessions and careful touches and whispered words, he was still afraid that this was somehow artificial, a product of isolation and unusual circumstances rather than genuine feeling. I brought his hand to my lips, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. I promise. This isn't the storm, Marcus. This is me. This is real. He searched my eyes as if looking for any hint of doubt or deception. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him because some of the tension left his face. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. I leaned down and kissed him one more time, soft and lingering, trying to put all of my certainty into the contact. When I pulled away, he was smiling, not the careful professional smile I was used to seeing at work, but something genuine and warm and meant just for me. Coffee? I asked. Coffee, he agreed. I made my way to the kitchen, hyper-aware of his eyes following my movements. The morning routine felt surreal after the intensity of the night. Measuring coffee grounds, filling the pot with water, the mundane actions of daily life continuing despite the fact that everything between us had changed. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of snowplows working on the main roads. Civilization was reasserting itself, pushing back against the isolation that had made this night possible. Soon, people would come to check on the stranded guests to make sure everyone had survived the storm safely, and then we'd have to figure out what came next. Marcus joined me in the kitchen as the coffee finished brewing, and we stood side by side looking out the window at the transformed landscape. The world was blindingly white and pristine, beautiful in its completeness, but I found myself missing the wild darkness of the storm that had brought us together. It's over, he said quietly, and I knew he wasn't talking about the weather. I turned to face him, seeing my own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. We were standing at a crossroads, balanced between the safety of pretending this had never happened and the risk of trying to build something real from what we'd discovered. It doesn't have to be, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, then reached out to touch my face, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with the same gentleness he'd shown in the darkness. I want to believe that, he said. I want to believe that what happened here can exist outside this cabin. But I'm scared, James. Scared of ruining what we have, scared of making things weird at work, scared of wanting something I can't have. What if you can have it? I asked. What if we can figure this out together? Before he could answer, we heard the distant rumble of a large vehicle making its way up the mountain road. The rescue we'd been waiting for was finally coming, bringing with it all the complications and considerations we'd been holding at bay. Marcus stepped back, the moment broken, his expression shifting back toward the careful neutrality I knew so well from the office. I watched him rebuild his walls in real time, saw him preparing to face the outside world as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. And as I watched him armor himself in professionalism and appropriate distance, I made a decision. I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen, I said firmly. I'm not going to go back to polite small talk and careful distance and pretending I don't feel what I feel. I can't do it, Marcus. Not after last night. He looked at me with surprise and something that might have been hope. What are you saying? I'm saying that I want this. I want you, and I'm willing to figure out how to make it work, whatever that takes. I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. But I need to know that you want it too, not just in isolation, not just when we're trapped by circumstances, but in the real world, with all the complications and risks. The sound of the approaching vehicle was getting closer. We had minutes, maybe less, before our sanctuary was invaded by well-meaning rescuers and the demands of returning to our normal lives. Marcus looked at me for a long moment, conflict playing across his features. Then slowly he reached out and took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt like a promise. "I want it too," he said quietly. "I'm terrified, but I want it too." The relief that flooded through me was so intense I felt dizzy. "Then we'll figure it out, together." He squeezed my hand, and for the first time since dawn had started creeping through the windows, his smile was genuine and unguarded. "Together," he agreed. Outside, the vehicle had stopped, and we could hear voices calling out, checking to make sure everyone was safe. Our time alone was over, but somehow that felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. As we moved apart to make ourselves presentable for rescue, Marcus caught my eye one more time. "Thank you," he said softly. "For this, for last night, for being brave enough to want something real." I smiled back at him, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Thank you for whispering the truth in the dark." The sound of footsteps on the cabin's front porch announced that our rescuers had arrived. In moments, we'd be swept back into the world of responsibilities and complications, of Monday morning meetings and office politics, and all the practical considerations we'd managed to forget for one perfect snow-locked night. But as Marcus straightened his hair and I smoothed my rumpled clothes, I felt something I hadn't expected: anticipation. Yes, there would be challenges ahead. Yes, we'd have to navigate carefully around workplace policies and professional boundaries, but we'd also have something worth fighting for. The storm was over, but what it had revealed between us was just beginning. Yes.